be talking about LNG with a specific focus on New England. So it'll be a little bit different talk in the sense that I'll be doing a bit of a deeper dive into one particular subject. So I won't be talking about the world market for LNG, because I feel you probably can hear that from many, many people. Or alternate uses of LNG, something we're very involved in right now. But again, you've probably heard a lot about that. And same with LNG exports, something that we're also involved in. But again, something you probably hear from many sources. So I'm going to concentrate on specific issues regarding natural gas and LNG in New England, where we find today really the results of the convergence, a polite way of saying convergence, really collision of the gas and electric markets, and how that's being played out currently. It's a current problem, and it will be interesting to see. It certainly will play itself out over this winter. Anyone involved in the electric or gas industry in New England is living with the Chinese curse of may you live in interesting times. A bit about ourselves. As Barry mentioned, we're a subsidiary of Gdf Suez. We've been operating the Everett, an LNG terminal in Everett since 1971, which was originally put there to provide natural LNG for peaking gas for LDCs, for natural gas distribution companies during the winter period. That business has existed for 40 years. There's a network of 46 LNG tanks throughout New England. And that's on an average, average year, maybe 10,000 LNG trucks are delivered to the various gas distribution companies in New England. District Gas, as Barry mentioned, is a Gdf subsidiary, a Gdf Suez subsidiary. For those of you that don't know Gdf Suez, it's a large French-based utility company. Primary interests are power generation and LNG. On the power side, Gdf Suez is one of, if not the largest independent power producer in the world. It has over 200,000 employees. It does operations in over 60 countries, revenues of over $100 billion a year. On the LNG side, which is its other primary business, it's the third largest buyer of LNG in the world, behind only Tokyo Electric Power and KOGAS. In the U.S., we have 13,000 megawatts of power generation. 5,000 of that is in New England, and we have the LNG business, as I mentioned earlier. Our requisite disclaimer: pay no attention to anything I say. Is the basic message from that. Some of the issues with natural gas in New England that we have right now is that New England is very dependent upon natural gas for its power. Over 50% of the power generated in New England is gas-fired. New England is more dependent on natural gas for its power than any region in the country except for Texas. And at the same time, New England itself has no production of natural gas in the region, more importantly, has no natural gas storage in New England. The nearest gas storage of any consequence to New England are essentially in the Marcellus area, where gas is being produced in a large way now. It had been traditionally, and still is today, a primary gas storage area for the Northeast. Power generators, and really the issues that we're dealing with now in New England have to do primarily with the market design for power generation. Power generators in New England get a capacity payment for essentially being there. And then they bid into a daily market, a typical deregulated electric market. There are no incentives for a power generator to purchase firm pipeline capacity or get a firm gas contract for their supply. So they buy gas in the daily market and they contract for interruptible capacity. Most of the year that works quite well. The gas companies, the LDCs, buy firm pipeline capacity for their heating customers in the wintertime, and most of the time, and they buy enough for just about, let's say, 350 days of the year. And so for most of the days of the year, they're able to release the capacity, and the power generators buy interruptible capacity, and they're able to run their power plants. When the weather gets cold, the system and increasingly breaks down because the LDCs need the gas for their heating customers. So they essentially are, from a west to east perspective, there are capacity constraints if you were looking for gas that is flowing from the west. There's a great deal of debate right now in New England on how to solve this problem. There are several solutions to it, and there are a couple of interesting overlays that in some ways make the problem better or worse. One of the solutions for this winter is an increasing reliance on oil-fired generation. You would observe obviously that's at a very high price. And it also, from an environmental perspective, obviously is not as clean as say, gas generation or other uses or other methods. Another potential solution that's been talked about on a long-term basis is what I call a pipeline overbuild, which is to build way more than you need today, tomorrow, and for years into the future. One particular problem with that is that electricity demand in New England over the years has been shrinking. So we see a phenomenon where the overall electric demand in New England has been shrinking slowly, yet the peak days have been increasing. So it's an interesting dynamic. And a third is what I'll be talking a little bit about today is more LNG peaking. Essentially, New England's issues are peaking issues. They're not baseload issues. And that's important because if you know how pipelines are built in the United States, essentially pipeline companies will contract for long-term, they'll enter into long-term contracts with people that buy the firm capacity, then they go to FERC for a certificate of necessity and convenience, and they build a pipeline. And obviously, it takes several years to do. In New England, it's generally a very expensive proposition. The prices that were quoted from the pipeline companies are generally around $200,000 per inch mile. To put that into maybe something that's more readily understandable, what that means is that if you want to run a pipeline from the Hudson River, from New York or New Jersey to Boston, 24-inch pipeline, 600,000 MMBTU per day, just a standard pipe, it's roughly a $2 billion proposition. And so if you're looking for gas for 10 days out of the year, it's unclear that it's good to do that, even if your alternative is to buy some other fuel at a higher price. And that is sort of why, and that is why we are in kind of the situation that we're in today in New England. Pipeline expansions historically in the past have been to meet LDC load expansions as people, primarily residential, but also commercial uses for natural gas have increased over the years. LDCs would expand their system. They would contract for pipeline capacity. When there was enough for a pipeline expansion, the pipeline expansion would happen. And that's something that continues today. There's a pipeline project that will likely go ahead, Spectra's AIM project, which is just exactly that, for increased LDC use for home heating. The use of LNG as a peaking fuel right now is for power generation is being hindered, and this is true for every fuel at this point. What we've seen in New England with respect to high prices for electricity, high prices for gas, have really been driven by the market structure, the market structure for electricity, which does not allow or does not provide any incentive for generators to contract long term. What's brought this on, and why has this happened it's really been just in the past few years, and it really has to do with, interestingly enough, lower price domestic natural gas. The a couple things have happened. Power prices have really dropped dramatically. When I say power prices, what I really mean is what the power generators refer to as the spark spread. The amount of money that they can make by running has really dramatically fallen. And as a result of that, the power generation in New England is really not a profitable business at this point. And as a result of that, there's very little reason for people to want to build new plants or build them in areas where they could get gas, and at the same time, parts of New England are load pockets. So, meaning that a certain amount of in-region generation is needed to make it to balance the grid, just from a physical standpoint, and so that's also exacerbated some of these issues. To deal with it, what ISO New England has done a couple of things. One is to rely, essentially purchase oil for oil fired generating plants and dual fuel plants to turn on oil during the wintertime. We've also initiated some demand response activities. Demand response is interesting because demand response generally is good for about 400 megawatts in New England, maybe 200 in the region around Boston. But it has not historically proven to be reliable, meaning that if you would ask the grid operator what happens if they call for demand response, they don't exactly know. And it's certainly not as reliable what they would get in terms of a reduction as it would be from turning a power plant on. And I think people intuitively understand that. LDC expansions, as I mentioned, are being promoted in Connecticut for LDCs for their use, which will again which will increase natural gas demand. It will increase the peaks, and it's again driven by really a good policy point of view from Connecticut. Connecticut, only 31% of Connecticut homes use natural gas. Almost all of the others use heating oil. So if you think of heating oil at $4 a gallon, you think of natural gas, even on a delivered cost to the customer, would be about the equivalent of $1.50 oil. It really makes good policy sense to promote that, and they're doing that. Massachusetts, the agenda is really driven by a desire to increase renewables, and that's really solar, it's wind, also some demand response, efficiency, and particularly with the renewables, these are intermittent resources, which on the one hand lower overall demand, on the other hand, or lower the overall need for natural gas, but on the other hand, increase peaks, because again, the intermittent nature of these resources are such that they tend to increase the peaks. So as a result of this, now in Maine is an interesting case. Maine has allocated some money for the state to contract for pipeline expansions. But obviously, if you're thinking about pipelines coming from the Southwest, let's say from the Marcellus region, you have to get through Connecticut and Massachusetts before you get to Maine. So basically, Maine will be piggybacking on pipeline projects that will go ahead, but they're not really in a position, and nor have they allocated anywhere near enough money to bring pipelines directly to Maine. So, and Maine's agenda essentially is to just bring cheap energy in. Maine's energy costs are among the highest in the country, and just for economic development, and it makes sense. You can understand why they would want to bring natural gas into Maine. ISO New England's perspective. ISO New England is the grid operator that is now finds themselves in the position of, some would say, an over-reliance on natural gas, given that it's about 50% or a little bit more of their fuel mix. This is a quote from Gordon Van Wiley, their CEO, in recent testimony before Congress, where he described the situation as being unsustainable. I think that's it's certainly the consensus view from anyone in the industry in New England at this point. This became apparent last winter, where prices spiked as high as $30 per MMBTU during some cold days. From our perspective, we had made several offers going into last winter to provide what we call a short notice service for people not familiar with the natural gas industry. Generally, power generators have to, even if they're buying for a daily auction, they generally will have to buy their Monday gas on a Friday. You don't buy gas on weekends. and they generally have to buy a day ahead. And we had made several offers to provide short notice service, or no notice service, I should say, and had made several offers to essentially provide base load gas for the winter, and it weren't, there was no interest because, again, of the market design, where the generator is just paid on a daily, it just bids into a daily auction. And if their price is not the lowest, they don't, it doesn't stack up in the queue, they don't get picked up, and if they've made arrangements to buy gas, well, now they'll be on the hook for it. So it's perfectly understandable why they wouldn't do it. The result of it is, though, of course, there were several occasions last winter where I had gotten frantic calls on a Sunday afternoon while watching the football playoffs asking me how much LNG did I have in the tank, when my next delivery was, and how much gas could I send out tonight and tomorrow morning. It's obviously not the way to run an electric grid, and it's certainly, it's not reliable, it's not economical. The reason I say it's not economical is that we talk about the prices of natural gas very often, but it's a physical business. You don't heat your house with a dollar bill. When you turn the light switch on, it's not a dollar bill that makes it go on. It's a very physical business, and in the LNG business, it's very much because of the investments involved in the LNG supply chains. To put it in perspective, a modest LNG supply chain is probably a $7 or $8 billion proposition by the time you've done liquefaction, shipping, and regasification. So what happens in the LNG industry is that it's very much characterized by efficient, just-in-time type of deliveries. Very, very lean on storage is a characteristic of the LNG industry. And what's also characteristic about the LNG industry is that it's a small world. Everyone knows everyone else, and if for some reason and you have to have gas in your tank to sell. It's a pretty simple thing. My worst nightmare is to run out of gas because then that's it. There's nothing else. There's nothing left. So I have to obviously manage inventories, and we can only sell what we buy and things like that. It gets complex, but it's basically simple. The upshot of all this is if we don't contract in advance to supply people, and all of a sudden they want it in large quantities, well, it's not very easy to go out and buy another cargo of LNG. You can buy LNG on a bilateral basis, but it's a small world. Everybody in the LNG business knows each other. If you need to buy a cargo of LNG because you're distressed, you will pay. You'll pay beyond the world price. And the way in the opposite direction, if you have to get rid of a cargo of LNG, you'll be lucky to get anything for it. It's just the way the business works. So to get the phone call, so this is maybe a little bit of background, or maybe too much background. But when I get the call on a Sunday evening saying, what can you supply tomorrow, there's a lot that goes behind that, and it's really not good for anyone. These are the current pipelines that serve New England. So you can see gas pipelines come essentially from the New York area, from Marcellus, from the Gulf of Mexico through New Jersey into New York. The main pipelines that serve the region are Algonquin, Tennessee, and Iroquois. Then from Canada, the major supply is the Maritimes and Northeast, which is a pipeline that can produce up to 800,000, can deliver up to 800,000 a day, but is mostly empty at this point because most of the supply comes from the Canaport LNG terminal, and Canaport has been operating at a low level and probably will operate at an even lower level in the future because their parent company, Repsol, sold their other LNG assets that they had worldwide to Shell. And so Repsol does not have the LNG supply that they did in the past. So at any price, it's unlikely that they would bring in cargoes into Canaport. And even in the event of price volatility, it's because of just the logistics involved, it's unlikely they could be able to get cargoes quickly enough to meet peak periods. Yet at the same time, I mentioned earlier that one of the solutions talked about is what I call an overbuild of pipelines. This basically shows both the gas demand in New England and the price of gas in New England expressed as a premium over the Henry Hub price. Now the green line is the west to east pipeline capacity in New England. The purple line is the total aggregate pipeline capacity. So you could see during the winters of 2010, 11, 11, 12, and 12, 13, there are a few days a year where the demand outstrips the west to east pipeline capacity, does not come close to the east to west pipeline capacity. And we could see in winter 10, 11, there was some impact on price when that happened. Interestingly enough, in the winter 2011, 2012, it didn't affect prices very much. And that was because winter did not arrive at all in the winter of 2011, 2012. You might remember it was just an abnormally warm winter. Everyone had extra gas, so even the arrival of cold weather had virtually no impact. But in the winter 12-13, you'll see, with a little bit colder weather, but still a warmer than normal winter, interestingly enough. A cold spike caused a price spike. That we've seen price spikes like this before, but not with this kind of cold weather. To put it in perspective, people in New England are talking about the cold snap last winter. Well, the cold snap lasted for about 10 days. Average temperature was about 15 to 20 degrees. From my perspective, that is cold, but it's not cold by New England standards. I'll put it in perspective for people who are not familiar. In the winter of 2004, we had a period during January, late January, where we had 14 consecutive days where the temperature did not rise above 0 Fahrenheit. That's cold. Under these conditions, and during that period of time, gas prices spiked as high as $60 per MMBTU. If that were to happen today, under today's conditions, I could not predict what would happen. The real problem is that at some point the price signals don't work anymore because there just isn't the physical capacity. We think the answer, after looking at this, really is a variation of what we've done for LDCs in the wintertime by providing them with liquid throughout the year that they use in the wintertime, is to provide it to power generators. Going back to the last chart, what that means is that during winter 10-11, there were 40 days of peak demand, 15 days in 11-12, and 18 days in the winter of 12-13. And we have what that translates to in billions of cubic feet, and even being generous, how much that means in terms of cargoes of LNG. Now, again, to put it in perspective, even at reduced levels of imports of LNG into Boston, we're still roughly 30 cargoes a year. At our peak, we're probably 70 cargoes a year. Gdf Suez, or district gas, I should say, has roughly 70 cargoes a year under contract. So, an additional 2 or 3 cargoes from the point of view of somebody in the LNG business is not a lot. But yet, and at the same time, if in a world where we have what we believe to be shrinking electric demand, and no mechanism to pay for it in the electric, under the electric market. And you might say, well, why don't they just change the rules? And as an observer, you'll probably get a lot of different opinions on that. My own observation, and this is more of an observer and not really a participant, is that the NEPOOL, the stakeholder group in ISO New England, and I suspect it's the same way in the other deregulated electric markets, includes all the various stakeholders. It includes the various states involved. It includes the power generators. It includes the distribution companies, poles and wires companies, the traditional utilities, each of which have their own economic interests, and each of which have their own reliability interests. And in that environment, it seems to be it's an environment where it's very hard to get anything done. Is the best way I could describe it. And so it's unlikely, and their own rules, which have to be approved by FERC, also take a very long time to promulgate. So this is a situation that will persist for several years, and will become exacerbated if we get a very cold winter. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. The last thing I should mention is that there have been disputes between the generators and the ISO when essentially the ISO had taken the position, if we call you to run, Mr. Gas Power Generator, you have to run. And the generator said, essentially, well, no, that's not what I signed up for. And that dispute actually played itself out at FERC over this summer. FERC's ruling to the generators was, if you can physically get gas, you have to get gas. But to the ISO, they said, if they can't get gas, they can't get gas. You can't penalize them. So so under that regime, again, there's been no change for this winter in the essential market structure, where we have a fixed capacity payment, a daily auction, and no long-term arrangements beyond 1 day. Just a quick commercial for District Gas. This is our LNG terminal in Everett. And what's the one takeaway from it, and one reason I included it, is that you have the practical question of, okay, I can bring a pipeline in. What power plants are connected to it? Are they the right power plants? Are they the power plants you need? One advantage of LNG from Boston, and deliberately so, is that it connects to every major pipeline, as well as the local distribution network, so gas can go where it's needed. Just to conclude, again, we've seen this interesting phenomenon where gas is cheap throughout the United States, but not cheap in New England during the wintertime. And at the same time, it's not clear what the answer is to provide an affordable and reliable service, which is really ultimately everyone's goal. The problem is a short duration problem, but again, if the lights don't go on in the wintertime, that's a problem. And I would characterize that as a relatively, not a high probability of something like that happening, but it's a high consequence, and much like the news reports we hear about the debt ceiling, it's something that nobody wants to happen, but the elements are in place for it to happen. And lastly, again, our own feeling, and just because of the characteristics of the LNG business, we believe that LNG really can provide the solution for New England and to provide peaking natural gas for peaking for power. But what really needs to be done is a mechanism put in place so that arrangements can be made in advance to facilitate the logistics and essentially pay for it.